Good evening. Welcome to Progressive Soup. My name is David Stevenson. It's Wednesday evening, but our show tonight and our show tomorrow at 12:30 will both be about veterans issues, and we're actually taping at the studio Monday afternoon, which is Pearl Harbor Day. So our show is dedicated to the events of Pearl Harbor that led us into World War II. But I have with me Michael J, Lieutenant Colonel, retired from the Marine Corps, who's been on the show a number of times, and Paul Kachevsky, who's an attorney.
Yes, sir.
Attorney that represents some veterans in their attempts to get their rightfully due coverage through the VA. And of course, Michael works with veterans in starting small businesses. So we've got two guys with their bona fides, both active service as Marines, and also working after the fact, after their return, to help other veterans. And I'll let you start off the show, Mike. Paul, you got talk about what you do and what led you to what you do.
Well, I've been an attorney for 16 years now, and I worked in a variety of industries, or I should say, I worked for a top 100 law firm. I've done a variety of things. I never really found what I liked. Then I got into helping veterans. It really struck a chord with me, and that's really all I do right now. And primarily what I do is to help veterans with their appeals at the VA, and to make sure that they understand fully what their rights are, and to make sure they get the benefits they deserve.
Okay, and Michael, you can refresh us with your background and
Sure.
what you do now. What led you to that point?
Well, thank you for having me aboard, Dave. So I started a program at the University of Connecticut. It's a nonprofit, but it's called the Entrepreneur Boot Camp for Veterans, and I help veterans start businesses. So we're in our 6th year, and we have started 96 businesses that have employ more than 180 people and have produced more than $27.5 million in gross revenues. Through that, I later went on to start the Connecticut Veterans Chamber of Commerce, which advocates in the Connecticut General Assembly for veteran business owners, and we've been successful in passing a number of laws that benefit veteran businesses in the state. And then lastly, recently I was confirmed to an advisory position with the Small Business Administration, specifically the Advisory Committee on Veterans Business Affairs, and we advise the Small Business Administrator and the President of the United States on policies and laws affecting almost 3 million veteran business owners in the country.
Excellent. Now let's get right to the crux of the matter, and that's problems that veterans face, and both of you see that in your day-to-day lives, and then a little more about what not just what you do to assist veterans, but what the rest of us can, what support we can provide to friends and family and people we run into that have veterans, and the issues that accompany being a veteran, especially in active combat, and take it from there.
Well, the way I came to this is, having been wounded in Iraq and having been medically retired, trying to reintegrate into civilian society at a time when the economy was very, very bad. And I found that myself and many other veterans were having difficulty re-entering the civilian world, re-entering the labor force. And so those were the real issues for this generation of combat veterans, and issues attendant to workforce reentry were juggling or managing disability issues, specifically around post-traumatic stress and traumatic brain injury, which are the signature wounds of this particular war. And I think going forward, we're going to start seeing a lot more have been called burn pit syndrome illnesses.
Define that.
One of the big issues, and there's now a class action lawsuit against the big defense contractor KBR.
Kellogg Brown Root.
Right.
Okay.
They had these massive contracts in Afghanistan and Iraq to get rid of garbage. And their statement of work required that they have closed air incinerators. So they were supposed to have these containers that burned the stuff. But what they basically did is they just had like a giant field, and they had multiple of these things all over the country, and they would just burn everything in it. They would burn ammunition, they would burn building material, they burn chemicals, they burn acid, they would burn everything. And it was toxic, and everybody breathed that stuff in. And just now you're starting, or the VA is starting to see the first cohort of Iraq and Afghanistan veterans coming down with all kinds of cancers and stuff like that as a result of exposure to what is being called burn pit syndrome, which I think will wind up being along the lines of Agent Orange in Vietnam or Gulf War illness from the first Gulf War in 1990, 1991. So anyway, that's how I came to this work, is the reentry into the workforce and managing disability while in the workforce.
Yeah, we talked at length on shows that you've been on. You've been on quite a few shows with Progressive Soup. And we've talked at length about the one shining moment in America's history where we took care of our veterans, and that was early on in World War II when the GI Bill was written, which planned well in advance of a lot of young men, women coming home on benefits for them that really set the gold standard in terms of America's repayment of its veterans. What do we need now for our veterans? What can we do to match that kind of gold standard, and how do we get there? And what part do employers and prospective co-workers of veterans, what part do they play in helping further that goal of getting a, if you will, latter-day GI Bill?
Well, there is some good news. Since we got the Military Occupational Specialty Act passed in 2013, went into effect in 2014, veteran unemployment in Connecticut has fallen by more than 50%. So the number of post-9/11 veterans who are in the workforce has risen dramatically. It's gone from over 9% to mid-4s now. And that is also a nationwide trend. So veterans are re-entering the workforce in much greater numbers and are finding employment. The second part is, the post-9/11 GI Bill is in effect, and many veterans are taking advantage of that. Right now, we are looking at a federal bill that would, and the debate is whether it would create a carve-out of GI Bill benefits for veterans to start businesses, or add an additional benefit for veterans to start businesses. But I really and truly believe that veteran business ownership is a part of the solution for our economic rejuvenation in our country. And that's what happened in the 1950s, while they were this sort of golden age of America. 1 in 5 World War II and Korean War veterans wound up using GI Bill benefits to start businesses. So I think that that's a important element, both legislatively and economically, going forward. The pieces are starting to be in place. We're able to make an argument and get a favorable hearing, both at the state level and at the federal level. And I think it's important because in the next 5 years, say between 2016 and the end of 2021, more than 1.5 million combat veterans will be leaving active service. About 300,000 a year for 5 years will be leaving active service and trying to re-enter the civilian labor force. So we're really just at the forefront of this sort of wave that's coming at us.
Paul, you work with a lot of veterans on their benefit package and getting money that they haven't that they've been entitled to but haven't been able to get. Because what are some of the problems that they face with the VA, and what some of the problems does the VA face? And you spoke before about serving VA serving two masters, so to speak.
Correct. The VA, unfortunately, has a dual mandate, and that is to save the taxpayers money and to provide the veterans their disability benefits. And depending on where the fiscal situation of the country is, you will find that veterans get turned down not because of any discrepancy in their claim, but because financially the VA just couldn't grant everybody. There's a number of claimants from the 70s and 80s and early 90s who were just turned down because at those time periods the government was in financial distress and basically really couldn't grant everybody, especially a lot of the returning Vietnam veterans. Just to let the veterans know, the biggest thing is education, is that a lot of the veterans don't know what they're entitled to. If you served in Vietnam, you basically are entitled to, if you get diabetes, it's related to Agent Orange exposure, heart conditions, a number of cancers, and the VA will not necessarily tell you that, but if you ask, they will inform you. That's kind of I guess where the VA kind of falls down. Their mandate is to, if you ask the right question, they're required by law to give you the right answer. But until you ask that right question, they will simply say, well, you didn't ask the right question. So,
is that a strategy, or is there a logic behind requiring them to be able to ask the right questions?
Well, it's an administrative agency, so they basically set up very complicated rules on how to obtain your benefits. I noticed that primarily when you were saying about post-traumatic stress disorder and TBIs, the system is actually designed to negatively impact those veterans the hardest because, generally speaking, the VA will require the veteran to either testify about his disability or to provide sufficient information so that they can make a positive assessment. But with TBI or post-traumatic stress, you may have memory issues, you may have cognitive issues, and the veteran may not be able to properly express where he's currently at. And the VA, if you go in and you have your C&P exam and you didn't explain your condition to them properly, they'll say, nothing wrong with the veteran. And that's the extent of their, once they fulfill their requirement under the code, they feel that they've done what they've needed to do. And sometimes it's a serious disservice to the veteran. But again, to education, if the veterans know what they're entitled to, and this has changed over time, I would like to point out that you basically had a varying situation. As prior to 1990, there was no Court of Appeals for Veterans Claims. So if you were denied at the VA, you had no recourse. There was no one to go and say, that I had my rights violated at the VA. Wow. Once you got to 1990, there was a Court of Appeals, and the Court of Appeals is very lenient. I don't want to say that lenient. I want to say concerned with veterans' issues. So if the VA doesn't do something right, they will kick the case back for a proper assessment. And that continued on for a number of years. There's a lot of really great decisions from the Court of Appeals. And then in 2007, I have Mike to thank for the legislation that passed that it used to be that attorneys could not be paid, or they were capped at $10. And that sum was set during the Civil War. $10 during the Civil War was a lot of money. But up until 2008, not so much. And you couldn't get a lot of attorneys to get involved with these cases, and then in 2007 they changed the law that attorneys could now get paid, and that has now introduced a number of attorneys to help veterans. You won't become rich doing it, but certainly if someone is inclined to help veterans, it certainly gives them a way to make ends meet, so to speak.
Do you mind I ask you what the compensation is, and is that a reasonable amount?
The compensation is 20%. Well, there's actually two sets. There's 20 or 33. If you do 20%, it's presumptively fair, and you basically, on any back award, which means, like as an example, say a veteran files in 2001 and he's getting denied all the way through, and you jump on the case at some point and you win his case on appeal. Whatever disability you can backdate to 2001, there's going to be a back award check. The attorney's entitled to 20% of that, and the veteran will get his disability going forward. So that's kind of the way they worked it out. Where this can be very interesting is because of a lot of frivolous denials that occurred in the 70s and 80s. A lot of veterans are not aware that once he files a claim with the VA, if he's later granted for that benefit, he can backdate it to the first time he made that application, which, if that was in 1970, could be a very substantial award. But again, it's an education. A lot of veterans got denied. They felt they had no recourse, and so they just kind of let their case go.
There's 2 points here to this. So one, last year, the GAO, the Government Accounting Agency, published a report about the affordability of veterans' disability, service-connected disability compensation benefits going forward over the next several decades, saying that we cannot afford to continue to pay out, and came up with a number of ways to try to cap veteran service-connected disability awards, including lifetime caps or putting a window on when veterans can apply for certain service connections, et cetera, in order to, level out the cost curve for over basically the next 4 to 5 decades, which is this generation of combat veterans, their life expectancy. Interestingly, so that was in the summer of 2014. That was right when the new VA Secretary McDonald got confirmed, and it was also when Linda Schwartz from Connecticut got confirmed as the Assistant Secretary for Plans and Policies. Now, very interestingly, this past spring, the VA tried to change the rules for applying for a disability or making a disability claim administratively. They tried to make it so that right now it's what's called an open claim. If you make any written claim of any condition, if you say I have these headaches or I have this thing wrong with me, they consider that as a claim has been made. But what they tried to say is that you have to make a specific claim for a specific condition that they recognize, so that they're presuming that what their conditions are. And then I can't remember exactly what the window is, but they were trying to make a 1-year window where you had to complete your claim, otherwise the claim would be invalidated for
what you're talking about is an informal claim versus a formal
Correct.
claim. And what happens is when you get out of service, you have 1 year to submit a formal claim to backdate it to service date. You can make an informal claim at any time, and that could be a sheet of paper with your name, your social, and a date, and just what conditions you have. But in order to make a formal claim, you have to file a 526, which is an application for VA benefits. Once you file that 526, the conditions you put on that 526 will be the claims you're making. The VA, I think, overly restrictively views the statute. The statute, and I know the Court of Appeals has a number of cases on this, they view it that basically if the veteran says he has diabetes, and the veteran is later granted for diabetes, any condition secondary to the diabetes is presumptively under the diabetes claim, because the VA is required by law to properly evaluate the veteran for not only the primary condition but all secondary conditions related thereto. The VA is now saying, and I noticed that the paperwork has changed in the last couple of months, that if you don't make a claim for the specific secondary conditions, they're not going to grant. The Court of Appeals doesn't agree with them on that, and in fact there's a couple of decisions that came out recently. So I think there's now a little bit of a conflict between the VA on how they interpret the laws, because you both have a law, USC 38, and you have a 38 USC, and then you have a regulation, 38 CFR. And the law is what's set by Congress and the House and the Senate, and 38 CFR is the VA's own interpretation of those statutes. So you now have kind of a little bit of a difference in how those are read, and then the court is bound primarily by the law. So there can be a little bit of a disconnect between those two, and sometimes you just have to wait till the cases catch up to the interpretation, which can take years. Unfortunately, we have veterans who apply for benefits, and it takes them years and years to get it.
The other thing that you have, and this is the confluence of issues, is veteran-owned business in our country produce 10% of the country's GDP, right? And presumably something between 25 and 33% of that, goes to taxes. So the VA projects, or the GAO projects, that the VA is going to be spending $100 billion a year for the next 50 years on veterans' service-connected disability benefits, so $5 trillion a year. But the truth is that veteran businesses can produce enough tax revenue to cover the cost of veteran disability benefits, but they don't want to do that. And that is the argument for creating programs that create veteran businesses because they produce more and they can cover the cost of. But that's the argument that we're making at the federal level.
That's simply that just makes all the sense in the world, because veterans are no different than anybody else. They come here, they come back from their service to their country, and they're not looking for a handout. They're looking for an opportunity to be productive citizens again, to find their way back into, we'll call it the real world, the world that all of us see every day, and make a go of it, and in your case of small businesses, employment, and to be productive citizens, and to a mind that's at rest is a terrible thing, because if you're just sitting around not doing something productive, it creates all kinds of problems. So to get back involved in the world that they left when they went into the service is a great thing. And then the payback, as you say, the payback is that they're making money, they're paying taxes on it, which refunds the rest of us taxpayers for the investment we made in them.
And there's actually something called vocational rehabilitation, and that if you're at a 30% disability, which is, I mean, it's not that high if you just have mild PTSD or slight, you could get a 30% rating, and then you're entitled to vocational rehabilitation, where they will send you to school to educate you or teach you in a trade or a course of study that will allow you to be a more productive person down the road. And it's kind of one of those funny things where I have veterans, they try, and they can't get through it. And so what happens is that's a person who wants to be productive, he wants to work, but unfortunately at a certain point he's given it as hard a try as anyone can, and then at that point he's unemployable, because that's where you start drawing the line between slight post-traumatic stress and severe post-traumatic stress. When you start getting into the DSM-4 or 5 with the psychological conditions, if the guy has severe memory problems, he can't retain information, or he has anger issues, that's going to affect him from a working perspective going forward. And that's really what the disability rating is for. It's how it affects you from a work perspective. It's not exactly fair to everyone. Some people work with their brain, some people work with their body. If you're not a college graduate and you're not really going to proceed that way, and you have physical limitations, those will affect you more than if you have a severe psych condition and you want to be an accountant. If you have anger management problems and you blow up on your clientele, that's probably not going to be a good plan going forward.
Right.
But again, it's really, the system is designed to help veterans based on how it affects their ability to work. And sometimes it affects some people more than others. You just have to keep these things in mind.
2 points to what Paul just said. So Paul hit the nail on the head exactly in his opening statement, which is that the VA system is adversarial, and that's the worst thing for veterans, because veterans are already coming out of a combat situation, and they are getting into a combat adversarial situation with the VA, and they're being re-traumatized when they have to prove all this stuff all over again. And then the second thing is, for voc rehab, one of the real problems with voc rehab is the default is to get the veteran into a job, and oftentimes it's an entry-level job, not at the level that the veteran had been operating at while on active duty. And I run into this all the time. They consider self-employment as a option of last resort, and they say, well, if you can't do anything else, go to work for yourself, and that's absolutely the wrong thing to do.
It does.
That's a recipe for disaster, is to say, well, you can't work for anybody else and you can't do anything else, so why don't you open a business? That's a surefire recipe for bankruptcy. And
that's an issue related to structured environment, is that when you're in the military, it's a very structured environment. Some people come out and they just don't have the especially if they're suffering from a psychological condition or something, they just lack the tools to be able to have the self-discipline to proceed in a self-employment situation. There is one point I was going to make, actually, that of your comment from earlier. And that was related to the adversarial nature of the VA. They're not supposed to be adversarial. They're supposed to help the veterans. But in my personal experiences, if you have a post-traumatic stress or if you have a TBI, the number of forms the VA will send you is dramatically different than if you don't. And I had one case out of Tennessee, 2 guys, both paratroopers. One's 3-tour combat vet, one guy wasn't. The guy who's the 3-tour combat vet got a package with 47 pages of forms in it. And the guy who wasn't, same conditions other than the PTSD, his was 8. And when I went through the forms with the veteran, the forms had all been filled out already. He only had one form in there he needed to fill out. But it was buried under 47 pages of documents. And that, I have to be quite honest, that vet called me up and having an absolute panic attack. He was completely melting down. He didn't know what he was going to put on the forms, and I went through it all with him, and we got it. He just had to fill out this one form. And I think the VA does that on purpose. I would like to say they don't, but my impression is they do, is that if they see that you have a psych claim and that you're, because they realize that it's so stressful to a person with post-traumatic stress or a person with a TBI just gets frustrated with the system. They just can't deal with all these extra forms, that they fall by the wayside, that they basically say, look, I can't do this.
Well, here's what so it's like Catch-22, the book Catch-22, where if you say that you're crazy, it means that you're not.
Yeah.
So if you have a post-traumatic stress or TBI and they send you, 47 pages and you're able to navigate it, it must mean you don't have post-traumatic stress or TBI because you can navigate a complicated form like that. So, but it really is a Catch-22 situation when you have, and especially if you don't have an advocate. I was lucky I had an advocate because I had, especially when I first came back and I was dealing with all this stuff. And, that's how I wound up suing the VA.
We're going to come back and do a second show, and we're going to talk maybe a little bit more about what are some of the potential solutions for veterans in terms of what kind of jobs that are best suited for them, and what type of what type of ways we can best support them in their search to renegotiate their way back into the world around them, the world that doesn't involve combat. And we'll come back. We'll do that. We're going to keep on talking as we fade out, and then we'll come back and do a second show. I want to.